In July of 1264, Pope Urban IV fell ill. At the same time, a comet was spotted in the night sky. The comet would continue to grow in brightness throughout August and September, with a tail extending over 100 degrees across the sky. All the while, Urban's condition grew worse. As it faded out, being last recorded on October 3rd of that year, Pope Urban died. We could interpret the presence of the comet and its apparent connection with Urban's death in several different ways. It could be a cosmic coincidence, but perhaps it was an omen. And if so, could the danger be foretold and averted, or was it written in stone? Or was the comet the direct causation of his death? Or was it a divine spirit that came to take Urban's soul to heaven? In this video, we'll be taking a look at comets, what they were believed to be, how they were classified, when they were seen, and how they were viewed in the time before the telescope. In my previous videos on this channel, I have largely ignored comets as an astronomical phenomena. This is because comets didn't really fit into the paradigm of the time, and many astronomers doubted whether they were truly astronomical in nature, by which I mean beyond the terrestrial sphere. As such, comets are frequently entirely absent from astronomical texts. Ptolemy's Almagest does not even mention them. So, what did medieval astronomers really think about these enigmatic visitors? Although comets are rarely mentioned in the astronomical texts, this is not to say we can't find ample evidence of comets in the historical record. Many broad natural philosophy texts will include them, although there's a great deal of inconsistency on whether it's alongside texts on the terrestrial sphere, in sections on the celestial sphere, or awkwardly inserted somewhere in between. Specific instances of the appearances of comets are frequently found within historic chronicles. These are often found alongside various disasters, although it's not always clear whether the authors are simply listing them together, are asserting that the comet was a portent, or that the comet caused the calamity. We'll look at several instances of these in the second portion of this video when we examine specific comets. One of the oldest suppositions on the nature of comets comes from Pythagoras. His school taught that comets were planets, but that they never rose high above the horizon, and thus were rarely seen. However, there's a few immediate problems with this hypothesis. The first is that the Earth is round, so there is no single horizon. If a comet was low on the horizon for one observer, it would be high in the sky for another. Given that Pythagoras is believed to be among the first to teach a spherical Earth, these two ideas are generally incompatible. This could be solved if comets were like Mercury and Venus, never getting too far away from the sun. And this is the view that Hippocrates took on comets. But this has its own problem. Comets are frequently seen passing well above the horizon and can be viewed at any elongation from the sun. Ultimately, there's no way for Pythagoras' hypothesis to be viable. Anaxagoras offered another variation on the planetary hypothesis, believing that comets were planets that were close together in the sky, and whose light added together and became elongated. No word on how. He was joined in this by Democritus. Other Greek philosophers also supported vague notions that comets were somehow related to the planets. This included Apollonius of Mindos, who believed that comets were simply heavenly bodies like planets, but evidently offered no thoughts on their unusual shape or movement. However, other philosophers did not believe that comets were heavenly in nature at all. Aristotle rejected the notion that comets were in any way related to the planets, arguing that the planets all stayed relatively confined to the ecliptic, the yearly path of the sun across the sky, which defines the plane of the solar system. Comets, however, could be visible in any portion of the sky. Instead of considering comets as astronomical phenomena in the celestial sphere, Aristotle considered them meteorological ones. He proposed that comets, meteors, the Milky Way, and aurora were all related phenomena that were part of the terrestrial sphere of the classical elements of earth, water, air, and fire. While these would naturally be mixed up to some extent, creating the diversity of materials that we find in the world, there was still some degree of separation. Most of the Earth was at the core of this nested model. On it was the water, surrounded by air. All of this follows quite logically from our everyday experience. But just as these three elements were primarily nested, Aristotle needed a place for fire, and therefore stuck it on the outside as the largest of the terrestrial spheres. He proposed that the sun warmed the Earth, causing exhalations, essentially vapors, that rose into the sky until they encountered the region of fire, at which point they ignited, causing all of the phenomena described previously. Because the cosmos rotated around us, the friction caused between these two planes caused these objects to move across the sky. However, this theory had an obvious flaw. The flaw arises from the nature of the motion that I just described, which would draw a comet in an east-west direction. This motion should mean that the tail of all comets should be along an east-west axis, but in reality, their tails may point in any direction. Aristotle has little explanation for the nature of tails, stating only the kind of comet varies according to the shape which the exhalation happens to take. If it is diffused equally on every side, the star is said to be fringed. If it stretches out in one direction, it is called bearded. The first-century philosopher Seneca disagreed with Aristotle and attempted to return comets to the celestial realm. He argued that the nature of comets was largely similar to that of planets, being fiery and bright. Furthermore, he noted that comets lasted for quite a long time, as much as 6 months. He suggested that the friction which Aristotle proposed move the comets would, by nature, disrupt them and cause them to be far more chaotic in nature than observation showed. Next, he noted that none of the other phenomena Aristotle proposed as being caused by these fiery exhalations moves the way that comets do, in a curved trajectory, like planets. Thus, Seneca proposed that comets existed as part of the celestial sphere, in some unknown orbit beyond the moon. However, Seneca had no physical model, and his only contribution on this topic was a negative critique of Aristotle. The first observational evidence that supported comets as celestial phenomena comes from the Persian astronomer Abu Mashar in 829 CE. In one of his treatises, he notes that he witnessed a comet passing behind Venus. He knew that it passed behind Venus because Venus's color was not changed as it would have been had its light passed through the comet's tail. He also reported that others had made similar observations for Jupiter and Saturn. Next, I want to take a short break from the physiological understanding of comets and discuss how they were viewed in the astrological context. One of the first places we see this in a conceptual fashion, as opposed to omens associated with individual comets, is from Pliny the Elder. In his work, Natural History, he sets about trying to categorize comets by their shape. The forms he gives are long-haired, bearded, javelin or spear, dagger or sword, quoit, a type of dart, tub-shaped, like a cask, horned, torch, horse, shining, and goat. Associated with some of these forms, we start seeing astrological connotations being assigned to some of them. Where Pliny describes the javelin star, we can see that he is associating it with a terrible portent. He goes on to state that if a comet has 2 tails resembling a flute, it portends something unfavorable for the art of music. If it appears over the private parts of a constellation, presumably only referring to the constellations of humans, it portends immorality. If the comet forms an equilateral triangle or a rectangular quadrilateral in relation to other fixed stars, then it portends the coming of a man of genius and the revival of learning. If in the head of one of the serpent constellations, it brings poisonings. Interestingly, Pliny tells us that there was a temple in Rome in which comets were worshipped. This was due to Augustus Caesar deeming a comet at the beginning of his reign as a prosperous sign. We'll return to this comet a bit later. Pliny also notes that comets have been seen to change their nature as a mane-shaped, presumably referring to a horse-shaped comet, turned into a spear during the 109th Olympiad, around 344 BCE. He states that the shortest comet for which there are records was 7 days and the longest 180. As noted previously, the 2nd century astronomer Claudius Ptolemy did not make any mention of comets in his astronomical work known as the Almagest. However, comets do make an appearance in his astrological work, the Tetrabiblos. There, Ptolemy provides his own loose classification system, describing comets as coming in the shape of beams, trumpets, pipes, and other similar figures. He then instructs readers on how to interpret comets, stating that they have a similar nature to that of Mars and Mercury, causing wars, atmospheric turbulence, and evil deeds in man. He states that observers can determine the land on which these calamities shall fall by noting the direction in which the comet lies. Another attempt at categorization for astrological purposes came from Hephaestion of Thebes, an early 5th century astrologer in his work Pre-telescopic. He lists the types of comets as planks, trumpets, casks, the horseman, the swordfish, the torch, the comet, the disk, the midwife, and typhon. As we can see, some of these overlap with the forms presented by Pliny as well as those of Ptolemy. Hephaestion also goes beyond the previous works and assigns various cometary forms to specific planetary aspects. The horseman is linked to Venus, Aphrodite, the swordfish to Mercury, Hermes, the torch to Mars, Ares, the comet to Jupiter, Zeus, and the disk to Saturn, Kronos. The rest are not given any planetary associations. Again, the portents of these comets are largely negative, although the comet form signifies the good benefits of Zeus if it appears in Cancer, Scorpio, or Pisces, which echoes Ptolemy's call to examine the zodiac signs in which comets appear. This text is the inspiration for a later work, frequently found in the medieval period, entitled De Cometis, although the text is often misattributed to Ptolemy. This text renamed the various comet forms to the soldier, the Lord of Ascona, the Goddess of the Morning, Silver, Dark, Rosy, the Brooch, and the Staff. However, the connection to Hephaestion's Apotelesmatics is revealed when examining their descriptions and astrological implications. For example, the comet referred to as the horseman by Hephaestion is now referred to as the soldier, but both are associated with Venus, described as being bright as the moon, causing harm to kings and powerful people, and other changes. As with before, the implications are generally negative, although the silver comet brings a fertile year in the lands over which it shines, again for the form associated with Jupiter, although this text no longer restricts it to specific signs. But a novel addition in this text is that the final comet form, the staff, is given additional implications if it is in conjunction with various planets. If it is in conjunction with Venus, there will be a greater drought. If with Mercury, the young and wise will die. If with the moon, people will waste away. If with Saturn, the deaths will be greater. If with Mars, there will be war and many will die by the sword. If with Jupiter, whatever it signifies will impact kings and rich men. Several early Christian writers give comets only negative connotations. In particular, Gregory of Tours, Isidore of Seville, and Bede the Venerable were instrumental in the transmission of what little astronomical knowledge did make it from the Greek tradition directly to the Christian West without the several hundred-year detour through the Middle East, and thus strongly colored the perception of comets. This will be evident as we go through the comets in the next section. However, beginning around the 14th century, we start seeing arguments against this negative view of comets. Antonio Pierozzi argued that the light of comets shines on all. Why then should it target only the powerful? Melchior de Parma noted that powerful figures die all the time, regardless of whether or not comets are seen. He goes on to add that control over life and death is the providence of God alone. This argument is very similar to the ones against astrology more generally that I discussed in my video on Christianity and astronomy, in which the church held that stars could not control destiny, as that was contrary to the doctrine of free will. But jumping back to the more nuanced views, in the 13th century we find the Liber de Significatione Cometarum, believed to be written in 1238, although its author is unknown. In this text, the author appears to have simplified the interpretation. removing the examination of shape, color, and associated planet. Instead, they only consider what signs of the zodiac the comet appears in. For example, the author tells us what happens when the comet appears in Aquarius. As you might expect, it's a lot of doom and gloom with a corruption of the air, wars, and death. But curiously, there will be plenty of bread. This book is also one of the rare instances where we do see an influence from Eastern astronomy, as the author refers to the sages of India. They inform us that these sages recommend simplifying the astrology even further. Instead of looking at the individual signs, it is recommended to look at the elemental nature of that sign. For example, Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn are all earth signs, so if the comet appears in any one of these, it will have the same meaning. This time, a lack of bread, probably due to drought, as well as dry illnesses such as scabies, and that cattle will die and mines will cease to be productive. This new focus on the signs through which a comet passes is also important because it helps set the stage for a reformation in astronomy as it comes to comets. Specifically, if astrologers needed to be concerned with the movement of comets through the signs, they would need to do a better job of observing the position of comets. An example of this comes from Peter of Limoges. In 1299, he described using an instrument known as a torquetum to observe a comet and recorded its position. He did the same for another comet in 1301. But a century later, astronomers would start measuring comets' positions for scientific reasons. The first was Paolo dal Pazzo Toscanelli. He observed comets that appeared in 1433, 1449 and 50, 1456, 2 in 1547 and 1472. He plotted their positions in an attempt to predict how they would move. Here is his diagram showing the motions of the comet from 1449 and 50. If you're not familiar with the constellations, here's those drawn in. Contemporary to Toscanelli was Georges Purbach. Purbach attempted to measure the distance to the comet of 1457 by parallax and claimed success. From his observations, he concluded that the comet was at an altitude of 1,000 German miles. Aristotle's nested sphere model was still prevalent, and this height would place the comets near the highest part of the sphere of air, just below the layer of fire. Purbach concluded that at such a distance, the comet would be 80 miles in length and 4 miles thick. Next was the German astronomer Johann Regiomontanus. In 1472, he published a treatise entitled On the Comet regarding the comet of 1472. There, he laid out his observations of the comet, concluding that it was at an altitude of 8,200 German miles, which placed it in the Aristotelian sphere of fire. He determined that the comet's head was 26 miles in diameter and the coma, the hazy sphere around the head, was 81 miles across. In both of these cases, the observations seem to support Aristotle's model. Obviously, in both cases, the estimations of parallax were vastly overestimated, and thus the distances vastly underestimated. Regiomontanus reported a parallax of 6 degrees. Modern estimates based on the trajectory of the comet indicates that the parallax should have been 3 arcseconds, or 7,200 times smaller than Regiomontanus's estimate. Next, the years of 1531 and 1532 each saw the appearance of a bright comet. These appearances led to one of the most important discoveries about comets prior to the invention of the telescope. Two astronomers, Peter Apian and Girolamo Frascatoro, independently determined that the tail of a comet always points away from the sun, as illustrated here in Apian's treatise on the comet of 1532. This observation was difficult to explain in the Aristotelian model. Frascatoro immediately abandoned the notion that comets were meteorological and instead placed comets in a new sphere just inside the lunar sphere. Apian, meanwhile, attempted to cling to the idea that comets were something caused by our atmosphere. He seized on the connection to the sun and proposed that they amounted to a lens, and that the tail was caused by refraction of light from the sun through it. This view was built upon by the mathematician Jean Pena, who realized that a cone or a pyramid of light would only be possible through a spherical lens. These ideas form the hypothesis now known as the optical theory of comets, which would persist through the 16th century, although some astronomers would still attempt to place comets in the celestial sphere. For example, the mathematician Girolamo Cardano placed them in a sphere just beyond the Moon based on the speed with which they seemed to move. But the most important pre-telescopic observation of comets was conducted on the comet of 1577. In November of that year, the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe determined the parallax of a comet and determined its distance to be 260 to 300 times the radius of the Earth, which is about 5 times further than the Moon, placing it near Venus's sphere. Brahe was joined by 4 other astronomers who also concluded that the comet must lie beyond the lunar sphere: Helasius Rosslin, William IV Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, Cornelius Gemma, and Michael Meslin, who taught astronomy to Johannes Kepler. Brahe also realized that the motion of the comet was such that either the path had to be non-circular or the speed not constant. This challenged the long-held belief in astronomy that any object in the celestial realm had to move on paths of perfect circles with a uniform speed. Meslin also calculated an orbit for the comet and concluded that the motion must also be non-uniform. He also determined that the orbit lay in a distinct plane, similar to the planets, although highly inclined. These conclusions were among a handful of realizations in the 16th century that shattered the Aristotelian concept of the cosmos and helped pave the way for Kepler's model of the solar system, which featured orbits that were both non-circular and non-uniform in speed. Now that we've covered a history of the understanding of comets, I'll discuss a few of the especially interesting ones. This is, of course, not going to be anywhere near approaching a comprehensive list of comets prior to the 17th century. The Chinese records list over 370 comets in this period. In this section, I'll mostly be going chronologically, except in cases where we discuss returns of the same comet, which I will group together. Since we started with Aristotle before, let's begin with him again. In his work, Meteorologica, Aristotle describes a great comet that appeared in November of 371 BCE. Here we can already see that comets are being tied to great disasters, as Aristotle relates this one to an earthquake and a tidal wave that destroyed the cities of Helike and Bura. However, that earthquake happened in December of 373 BCE. We know this wasn't simply a legend because these cities were, in fact, rediscovered in 2001, buried in an inland lagoon. This comet was also reported by other writers such as Callisthenes and Ephorus. Callisthenes reported that the comet's tail had a reddish color. Ephorus's original account does not survive, but is commented on by Seneca the Younger in his Naturalis Questiones. There, Seneca claims that the comet was not simply related to the destruction of the cities, but was the cause of the destruction, stating these were a great tragedy which the comet produced as soon as it appeared. Seneca also reports that Ephorus stated that the comet split in two. Seneca rejects this, as no division was recorded by any other observer. However, modern astronomers consider this notable detail to be a true account. This is because a comet observed in 1880 was found to have an orbit unusually similar to another one observed in 1843, followed by another one in 1882. All of these comets were exceptionally bright because they came extremely close to the Sun. They also had the furthest points of their orbit in the same direction on the sky and had a similar orbital inclination. In 1888, Heinrich Kreutz proposed that these comets shared a common origin, having broken up from an earlier comet, breaking into 2 major pieces. The first piece had a new orbital period of around 350 years, and the second had a period of 7 to 750 years. These comets are now referred to as Kreutz-Sungrazer comets. The fragment with the longer period is believed to have returned in 363 CE and was described by the Roman historian Ammonius Marcinellus, who informs us that in broad daylight, comets were seen, and lists this as one of several omens related to the death of the Emperor Jovian, which followed shortly thereafter. Another fragment returned in February of 1106, which was recorded by observers in Wales, England, Japan, Korea, China, Europe, and Egypt. Again, we see that the Welsh record is associating this comet with the death of a king, as Henry IV died a few months later. Interestingly, the Chronicon ex Chronica describes the comet of 1106 forking into many rays, and states that there were accounts of people witnessing several strange stars around this time. And the Chinese accounts state the luminous envelope was scattered. This has led astronomers to suspect that this fragment too broke up during this return. The fragments generated in this disruption would return as the Comet of 1882 and Comet Ikeyaseki in 1965. Moving on to the Comet of 134 BCE, we have Mithridates using a comet as a positive omen. In antiquities, various legends declared that a new star would mark the birth of a savior that would bring about the end to an oppressive empire. Thus, when Mithridates rose to power as the ruler of the kingdom of Pontus, he seized on this legend, as he had been born in the year before the appearance of a great comet. He went so far as to issue coins featuring the comet. This comet was described by Pliny the Elder as having the mane of a horse, which is echoed in the coin here, showing a horse head flowing from the comet. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was killed in the Roman Senate. Quite often, Roman rulers were deified upon their deaths, but Julius Caesar had a better claim to this than most, as a comet appeared shortly after his murder, which was depicted on a coin commemorating him. Several authors refer to comets in association with the death of Caesar. Not the least among them was Caesar's heir, Augustus, who is one of the sources stating that the commoners believed that the comet was a sign that Caesar had been deified. In response, Augustus states that he added the decoration of a star to the statue of Julius, which he had dedicated. The poet Ovid explains the comet as part of a divine narrative of how Caesar's apotheosis occurred, in which Venus carried Caesar's soul into the heavens. As it did so, he tells us, it began to glow and take fire. However, other authors still put a negative spin on the comet. The poet Virgil described the comet as part of a list of calamities that occurred surrounding Caesar's death. Similarly, the poet Calpurnius Siculus regarded the comet as a foreboding sign that civil strife would plague Rome. But Julius Caesar was not the only Roman leader whose death was associated with the comet. The historian Cassius Dio tells us that the Emperor Vespasian's death was also heralded by a comet. However, I cannot find any other references to a comet this year, which is rather surprising because this was also the year of another major tragedy that likely would have been associated with a comet had there been one: the destruction of Pompeii. The only other source that mentions a comet associated with Vespasian's death is another Roman historian, Suetonius, who may well have been where Cassius received this information, as their descriptions are virtually identical. However, we may want to be skeptical of Suetonius as a source, as he seems awfully apt to associate comets with mortal peril to Roman rulers. For example, he also associates comets with the death of the Roman Emperor Claudius in 54 CE, and the threat to Nero's life from the Pisonian conspiracy in 65 CE, although in both cases these comets are backed up by Chinese astronomers. But lest you start thinking that there really is some connection between Roman rulers and comets, the reality is that comets are much more plentiful than we tend to think. The Chinese chronicles list 6 comets during the 14 years of Nero's reign. Thus, the chance of an emperor dying near the appearance of a comet is rather high. Either that or an awful lot of people wanted to kill Nero. The Roman historian Tacitus assumed that it foretold the Emperor Nero doing something bloody and horrible. He also mentions animals being born with deformities, although it's not clear if that was Nero's doing or the comets. Regardless, I'll stand by my comment that we should be skeptical of reports of comets. So let's take a brief detour and explore why. Historians of astronomy have long been skeptical of reports of comets, as pseudo-historians have been inclined to write comets into events as dramatic details regardless of their reality. For example, we have the account of Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian, giving an account of the sack of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in the year 70, describing a comet that foretold its destruction. He chides his fellow Jews for believing in false prophecies when such an obvious sign stood so prominently in the heavens. However, he describes the comet as being visible for a year, which is not possible. Furthermore, no other source lists the comet that year. Most likely, he was describing the comet of 66 CE, which was several years before the destruction of Jerusalem and was only visible for a month. Furthermore, one of the most important compilers of records of historic comets, A.G. Pingree, included accounts in his 1783 cometography from a supposed Lycosthenes. However, Lycosthenes was actually a 16th century German author who made up narratives to fill in gaps in the 5th century accounts of Roman writer Julius subsequens. Many accounts are recorded by writers who were not even alive when the comet was supposedly present. Thus, it becomes more likely that they are repeating an embellishment or creating one themselves. Another example of a comet of which we should be skeptical is brought to us by Gregory of Tours in his History of the Franks. As with Josephus, Gregory makes this outrageous claim that the comet was seen for an entire year. This comet, he tells us, preceded the bubonic plague that ravaged France in 571 CE. However, this comet is not confirmed by other sources. The closest comet attested to in the Chinese records is some 3 years earlier in 568. Returning to comets for which we have better supporting evidence, we have the comet of 400 CE, which was reported by a number of authors. Claudian Claudius tells us something of its path, and again tells us comets are associated with causing damage. Socrates of Constantinople echoes this, telling us it foreshadowed danger to the empire. While these two authors are not specific as to what these dangers were, other authors were more specific. Sozomen links the comet to an uprising in Constantinople, as did Prosper of Aquitaine. Later authors tended to echo these, including John of Antioch and Nicephorus Callistus. We also have Theostagoras, who ties it to a pestilence and describes the comet as sword-shaped, which was one of Pliny's categories of comets. Another dramatic comet was witnessed 18 years later. Philostagoras again tells us of it in his Ecclesiastical Historia. There, he states a total solar eclipse occurred on July 19th, at which point a bright comet became visible. However, the comet was unusual, with a stubby tail making it appear more as a flame. As with other comets, Philostagoras remarks that this one too brought wars and death, although Prosper of Aquitaine described this comet as a miraculous sign and associated it with the overthrow of a Spanish tyrant, likely referring to Attices, who was killed that year in the Gothic Wars in Spain. Next, let's look at a comet referenced in legends of King Arthur. In the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote the History of the Kings of Britain, which is the source of many Arthurian legends. Among them, he tells of Arthur's father, Uther, on campaign in Wales, then called Cambria, when a comet was spied. He asked Merlin what this meant, and Merlin replied that it meant that Ambrosius Aurelianus, the king of Wales, had died, and that the two tails of the comet foretold great things for Uther's two children. As with much of the Arthurian legend, we should again be skeptical, although there are authors contemporary to the comet that confirm its existence. However, they do not write of it as part of the Arthurian legend. Joshua the Stylite simply states that some believed it to be the broom of perdition, and others the spear of war. Previously, we turned a skeptical eye on Gregory of Tours for the likely false report of a comet in 571. However, he reports another comet in 582 which can be confirmed. This one he associates with blood and gore falling from the sky in Paris, as well as another outbreak of the bubonic plague in Narbonne that year. I suspect that the artist of this image was well aware of this description, despite the fact that it was supposed to be the comet of 1456, which we'll discuss later. It also features the deformed animals of the comet of 65 CE, which we discussed previously. Gregory also gives a more comprehensive description of the comet's time of visibility and position. He places the comet in a sequence of events between January, where he describes the intense thunderstorms as a common omen, and Easter, when he describes the heavens as being on fire, possibly an aurora, indicating that it was early in the year. He also notes that this comet was visible in the west for an hour after sunset. This matches quite well with the comet observed in Chinese records in mid to late January, which describes a comet to the southwest that year. Next, let's take a look at a comet spotted in February of 1066 and recorded by William of Malmesbury. He quotes a monk at his abbey named Ethelmar, or Elmer, seeing it and saying, "You've come, you source of tears to so many mothers. It is long since I saw you, but as I see you now, you are much more terrible, for I see you brandishing the downfall of my country." And only too right he was. For barely a month prior to its arrival, the king, Edward the Confessor, had died. He was replaced by Harold Godwinson, who was defeated in October of the same year at the Battle of Hastings by William the Conqueror. The comet was recorded in the Bayeux Tapestry, which has the text Isti Marantur Stellam, they marvel at the star. While this comet is certainly one of the most notable for its association with the historic record, it has also been recognized as one of the most famous comets of all time, Halley's Comet. While not intrinsically all that bright, Halley's path can bring it much closer to the Earth than many other comets, which is why it can appear so bright. It also has a short orbital period of just 76 years. Unsurprisingly, there are many other accounts of Halley's Comet throughout the historic record, so let's examine a few others. As a quick note, due to gravitational perturbations from the planets, Halley's Comet's period is not always consistent. Indeed, astronomers are generally hesitant to predict the return of the comet more than 2 returns in the future, even today. That said, astronomers have matched the returns of this comet to records dating back as far as 240 BCE by progressively using each set of observations to refine the orbit to better understand the previous return. Furthermore, depending on where the Earth was in its orbit, the view of the comet may be better or worse. For example, Halley's closest approach to Earth was in 837 CE, when, on April 10th, it came within 2.8 million miles of the Earth, about 10 times the distance of the Moon. This close approach made it exceptionally well recorded. However, the second closest approach of the comet was in 374 CE. This would have again been a spectacular sight, but due to the positioning of the Earth, it would have been best visible in the southern hemisphere. Thus, accounts of this return are quite rare. As such, I won't be discussing every return. Instead, I will only discuss the returns during which something interesting happened, either in the history or with the comet itself. Its passage in 12 BCE was recorded by the Roman historian Cassius Dio, who lists a series of omens associated with the death of the Roman general Agrippa. This is again validated in the Chinese records. Its next appearance in 66 CE was the one we previously referenced that Josephus likely observed in the years prior to the fall of Jerusalem. Cassius also associates a return of Halley's Comet in 218 CE with the deposing of another Roman emperor, the short-reigning Ophelius Macrinus. Macrinus was invested in 217 CE, but was overthrown the following year. Cassius tells us that the year Macrinus was killed, there was an eclipse, and what on a first reading sounds like 2 comets. Again, we should exercise some skepticism here, but this time with respect to the eclipse, as no such eclipse was possible that year. But with regards to the comets, this report is likely 2 reports of the same comet. The first one is the inbound leg of the comet's path. The comet would then pass close to the sun from our point of view on the Earth, making it visible only during the day. Then, as the comet is again outbound, it would again attain an elongation from the sun, allowing it to be visible during the nighttime hours. Another appearance of Halley's Comet occurred in 451 CE. This time, it was reported by the writer Hydadeus in his chronicles. There, he describes the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. This battle was one of the last major military operations of the Western Roman Empire, in which the Roman forces defeated Attila the Hun, halting the Hunnic invasion of Europe. Although Hydadeus tells us that the comet was one of many signs that year, and presumably associated with this battle, he does not seem to imply what he thinks the comet means. Is it warning of the invasion? Is it a sign of victory? Hydadeus is silent, perhaps leaving it to the astrologers to decide. The astrologer Eginhard tells us of another return of Halley's Comet during Easter of 837. Unfortunately for him, the king, Louis the Pious, spied the comet before Eginhard did and demanded to know what it meant, as Louis was obviously familiar with the general prognostication of comets killing kings. Eginhard tried to soothe him, but Louis evidently would not be calmed and took to acts of piety. However, despite Eginhard stating that Louis died shortly thereafter, Louis did not actually die for another 3 years. There is a popular story that upon the return of Halley's Comet in 1456, Pope Calixtus III was so frightened by it that he had it excommunicated. However, this appears to be an embellishment on the actual story as recorded by Bartholomew Platina in 1479. There, he tells us that the Pope was warned of the threat posed by the comet, but he ordered prayers asking God to direct his wrath upon the Turks instead of Christendom. In our introduction, I mentioned the Great Comet of 1264, which is associated with the death of Pope Urban IV. This comet's appearance is affirmed by Chinese astronomers who first noticed it on July 26th. Aside from the astrological assassination of a pope, this comet was particularly bright and spawned a number of treatises on its arrival. Works were done by Roger Bacon, De Cometis, Robert Grosseteste, De Cometis, Gerard Feltrinus, Summa de Ostris, and Agetius of Lesina, De Essentia Motu Significatione Cometarum. Next, I'll break with my previous comments and discuss a comet that was observed in 1366, but only recorded by the Chinese astronomers. The account describes the path of the comet as unusual. Jumping into the context of modern astronomy for a moment, if we were to look down upon the solar system, we would see the planets orbiting in a counterclockwise direction, as do most comets. But this comet's orbit is clockwise, or retrograde. This piece of information allowed a Japanese astronomer to associate this comet with the comet 55P Tempel-Tuttle in 1933. This comet was recognized as a short-period comet in 1886. However, despite returning every 33 years, the comet is quite faint, which is why sightings of it are so rare. But there's another way that this comet makes itself known. In 1867, Giovanni Schiaparelli proposed that this comet was responsible for the annual Leonid meteor shower that is visible mid-November each year, since its path lies quite close to Earth's orbit. Thus, when Earth passes through the trail of dust left behind, it causes a meteor shower. Records of this meteor shower date back even further than the comet, with observations in China, Egypt, and Italy reporting it in 902 CE. Now let's return to the comet of 1457, which we mentioned earlier as having been observed by Toscanelli and Purbach. Again, Toscanelli provides an illustration of this comet's path. Astronomers now believe that this comet was one of the earliest recorded observations of the comet now known as Comet 12P Pons-Brooks, which has an orbital period of 71 years. Astronomers also suspect that this comet was recorded in 1385 by Chinese astronomers. This comet was last visible in April of 2024, although it remained quite faint, visible only with telescopes except under near-ideal viewing conditions. And much like the comet of 1366, this comet too is believed to be responsible for a meteor shower, this time the relatively weak Draconid meteor shower, visible in early December. Unsurprisingly, one of the comets that we have the best records of comes from the 16th century as observational astronomy was rapidly gaining interest. The comet of 1556 was observed by the German astronomer David Fabricius, who produced this map of the comet's path. This record was lost for over 300 years. However, beginning in the late 18th century, astronomers began suspecting that this comet was the return of the comet of 1264, which would have given the comet a period of 292 years. However, when the comet failed to return in 1848, astronomers sought more information on the orbit of this 1556 comet, which caused this map to be rediscovered by the astronomers John Russell Hind and Joseph Johann von Littrow in 1856. As a side note, if the name Littrow sounds familiar, it's because there's a crater on the moon named after him, which helps define the Taurus-Littrow Valley, the landing site for Apollo 17. Again, this comet has been associated with disasters. The Dominican friar, Gaspar de Cruz, was visiting Guangzhou that year, and it coincided with a massive earthquake in Shanxi, which directly killed over 100,000 people. In a work he wrote in 1569, he wondered if the comet wasn't simply an ill omen for China, but the entire world, dramatically wondering if it could herald the birth of the Antichrist. This comet has also been associated with Charles V, who reportedly, upon seeing the comet, said, "By these signs, fate calls me." Some authors have suggested that Charles's abdication was related to the appearance of the comet. However, Charles had been abdicating the reins of various thrones he held since 1554, so the comet being responsible is almost certainly false. In the end, the study of medieval comets stands at the intersection of history, culture, and astronomy. These celestial phenomena, often regarded with fear, remind us of the enduring human quest to find meaning in the stars.